Today on In the House, we sit down with Matt Fajkus of Matt Fajkus Architecture in Austin, Texas. We look back on Matt's formative years and find out what drew him to the field of architecture. We talk about the significance of nature and the differences between modernism and classical architecture, and we get a crash course on sustainability and design. We also talk about what makes the team at MF Architecture stand out above the rest. We hope you enjoy this episode. Thanks for listening. All right, welcome to In the House. Today we have a very special guest with us today. We have Mr. Matt Fajkus of Matt Fajkus Architecture. Matt has dozens of accolades, including being featured on Architectural Record, DZine, Arc Daily, Dwell, The Wall Street Journal, and many others. His buildings have been on AIA home tours and other modern house tours. Matt is on the board of directors for the Harvard Alumni Club. He is an assistant professor at UT and was named a fellow at the Center of Sustainable Development. And a few things that we're proud to mention out of his extensive career are having the award, the 2023 Filtered Frame Dock got the Award of Merit from the American Institute of Architects. He's the winner of the Engineering, Architecture, and Design category at the 17th Austin Under 40 Award in 2015. And he's a winner of AIA Austin's Emerging Professional Achievements Honor in 2017. So, Matt, welcome to the show. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Well, we're just going to jump right into it. So, I kind of want to get your background. I think my goal is to really understand where your passion comes from. So I kind of want to let you have the floor, and I really want to kind of ask you about your background, where you grew up, where you went to school, and just kind of give us your history.
Yeah, it's an interesting path in terms of the passion for design and architecture. I am originally from the Austin area, from Central Texas. And the passion for design mostly began in an interest in drawing and just creating things. And so I wasn't sure where that would lead me early on. I just knew that I really liked to draw, and I like to be part of making things in some way. And also I just had an interest in buildings and in cities from a pretty early age. And in addition to that, I was also quite interested in nature, and which has really influenced a lot of the ways that I think about space and light, sequences, and a flow, and lots of different things. But I for my undergrad degree, I went to UT Arlington, to the School of Architecture, and which is a great program of architecture. I learned a lot from many different professors and mentors, and and then for grad school, went to Harvard University to the Graduate School of Design. And both of those really shaped my way of thinking about design and architecture and in many dimensions, and helped me to be, helped to give kind of a well-rounded way to kind of shape the passion for design and architecture, and really try to learn what to really do with that. And so, one of the ways I try to maintain that passion now is going back and into nature. I have a lot of interest in hiking and mountain climbing. In a lot of ways, those become these interesting ways to simulate the basics of architecture. And so for example, when you go on a multi-day backcountry hiking trip, you have to carry a house on your back, effectively, carrying a tent, which is a very simple form of structural skeleton and a skin. You have to carry so you're carrying a house on your back, you're carrying a kitchen, usually it has some stove with you, you're carrying a pantry, a fair amount of food, you're carrying a wardrobe in terms of lots of layers of clothes. And that becomes also a bit of a metaphor for architecture in terms of you have your waterproof layer, you have your insulation layers, you have these different choices of how you're going to layer your clothing. And then a similar thing to do with you also of course have your bed with you and a sleeping bag. But then when it comes to choosing a campsite, like you're sort of thinking about what's the best location to set up the site for this relative to the sun and the wind and protection from creatures and other things that are out there. And so it becomes this very immediate way to relate to the most fundamental aspect of architecture, which is shelter. And so that is something that really is inspiring for me still, and to force me to sort of try to stop and get back to the real fundamental primitive components of what it is we do. And I just recently came back from an expedition on Mount Denali in Alaska for 3 weeks, completely off the grid on a glacier to reach the summit of Mount Denali in this case with the whole team. But all those things came into play in terms of thinking about, in a lot of ways, it's survival, but it's then also about, okay, you do these things just to survive, and then how can you then enhance the experience and how you think about arranging whether it's your camp or your setup and the whole journey along the way. And so there are a lot of different things that have influenced me along the way, but that's one that's been somewhat of a constant throughout.
Well, how does that influence your work now? Going into nature, and like, how does you, all these hikes and you're traveling, how do you think that influences your work now?
Well, that's a great question. And I'll first take a moment to delineate my work versus the team's work. Because
Sure.
I think there's one thing about my personal inspiration and my personal interests, but that begins to fold into and blur into the work of the practice and the team of MFA. And so Sarah Johnson's the other principal architect. I hired Sarah shortly after founding the practice 12 years ago, and she's been there all along the way and helped shape a lot of this. And then we've hired
she's fantastic, by the way. She is absolutely a pleasure to work with. She's amazing at what she does.
So Sarah is great to work with, and then just a very talented team of individuals overall that all have a really important say. And so I want to be clear that my interests play into that, but I also try to leave room for everyone else to express their talent and be part of all of this. And so in terms of how my and our passion for design folds into the actual practice, is we really believe in modernism and with a capital M, meaning that it's about form follows function, as opposed to contemporary. I think often people confuse the terms contemporary and modern. Contemporary means more just of the recent. Modernism is a movement that started 100 years ago that had to do with really prioritizing function to drive form, as opposed to classicism, where if we think of any Capitol building, for example, where you have a completely symmetrical facade and all the windows are the exact same size on the north facade, the south facade, whether or not that makes any sense for the function.
Right.
Beyond it, the form is more important than function for classicism. And so modernism was a movement that began 100 years ago of saying, let's begin with the function. What does this need to be? How does it perform? Where do we need larger spaces? Where do we need smaller spaces? And then where do the openings happen as a result of that? That's the biggest driver of our work, which also comes back to that is the way that nature works. Anything that you see in nature, the reason its form exists has to do with the way it actually functions.
Right.
So a tree, for example, is beautiful, of course, but it's based on a functional performative logic. The leaves themselves are sort of like photovoltaic panels that take solar energy and convert it to nutrients and a different form of energy for the tree. Even the structure of the tree itself, the branches, have to do with then allowing those leaves to be able to capture light. And then the root system of the trees have to do with, of course, the structural support of the foundation of the tree will to allow this vertical cantilever out of the ground to work. And so all of nature is driven by the function. It's not a form just for the sake of beauty, but it ends up being beautiful because of the fact that it is just what it needs to be. And so that's something that laces through all of our work, and trying to balance that with, of course, our clients' wants and needs and interests. And so it's not only about how it performs, how a building would perform structurally, but also how it suits the needs of daily life and long-term goals of a given project. And so there are, Bucky Fuller has a quote where he says, I never set out designing something to try to make it beautiful, but I still want to start off thinking about function. But if in the end it's not beautiful, I know I've done something wrong. And so it suggests that if you focus on that rather than the form, you focus on the function and the performance, then the ultimate result does achieve aesthetics. And so, yeah,
that's interesting. Yeah, because when you look at nature, it definitely is function. Function follows form. And nature doesn't take anything extra. It just takes what it needs. And there's no excess. It's just like you said, the way the tree is grown. It is what it is. The leaves and the branches and all the way down to the roots. And I think you can really see that in your design. It really works with the landscape. It works with how light, how the sun interacts with the house, and the positioning on the lot and everything, and the capture views and whatnot. So I think that's definitely evident in your designs, or y'all's designs, since this is a team effort after all. So you're a assistant professor at UT, and can you kind of give us a little bit more information on that and what it is you do there, and what do you teach?
It's actually an associate professor.
Sorry,
not to pick on that too much, but that's
okay,
the difference between having tenure or not. And so I did get tenure in 2015. So I've been teaching at UT for 14 years, and for half that time, so I was an assistant professor before I became an assistant professor in 2015.
Awesome.
And that there are several different components to that role. Teaching obviously being a big part of it, and the teaching breaks down to teaching both design studios as well as lecture courses. So the design studios are more like workshops. They're a little more hands-on with a smaller group of students. You're effectively teaching the design process in a step-by-step way, in a more, again, direct format. So you give a hypothetical prompt to the students. You give them a site and a program and some goals for a project, and then they'll come up with ideas, and you critique the ideas, you critique their drawings along the way, and sort of coach them through that. And so I teach mostly graduate students, sometimes undergrads, but mostly graduate students for sometimes at the introductory level and sometimes the advanced level, it's really rewarding. It's also very time consuming. It's often 5 hours a day, 3 days a week, just for that one class. It takes a lot of preparation. But it's also really rewarding when you see that. So when you see the evolution of students' academic careers, let's say a light bulb come on, and like, I get this, I understand it, and it's also nice to be able to have control of what the agenda is for that class. So being able to choose the topic of exploration, what type of building will be designed, where the site will be, and then all the assignments that lead the students toward a design. It's nice having the ability to experiment over the years in different ways. The other classes I teach are more lecture-based classes. One of them is a structures course for undergrads. It's a required course for all undergrad architecture students. And it's more about the fundamentals of building structures as that relates to design. And so it's somewhat calculation based. The students have to go through a fair amount of calculations to determine how a building will perform, or performance of a beam or a truss, a very specific element. But I try to contextualize it in a way that relates to application in the design process, rather than just learning the theory of how to run through a formula, but to understand what it really means when thinking about structures conceptually, and being realistic about thicknesses of things, about what you can and can't do structurally. And so that's another one of the classes I teach. Another class I teach is called Light and Sustainable Design, which is a lot about daylight and architecture, both in terms of the more scientific aspects of that, in terms of thermal qualities and heat exchange, but also a lot to do with the more experiential and artistic components of the quality of light and how that affects everything from just the way that we see and the way that color is rendered to much even our circadian rhythms and different patterns that affect us in lots of different ways. So the teaching component's a big part of that role. And then I'm also the director of the Sustainable Design Program. And so there are some administrative components that go with that in terms of admissions of students into the Sustainable Design Program, advising their thesis work along the way, and then just other service components that come with that role. Serving on committees to help generally just improve the school, or there's some work to do in the trenches as well, and some scholarly work as well. I've done a fair amount of writing and co-authored a book with Dason Whitsitt, and then the practice the work that we do at MFA is considered creative scholarly work, and is also appreciated by the school, and the students as well, to appreciate sort of practicing what you preach, and to have so that's a fun thing as well, is that overlap between the two, because what I do teach in class is influenced by what we're doing in the practice, and then vice versa. What we do in the practice is influenced by what we're researching in school and exploring.
Sounds a lot more than 3 times a week, 5 hours a day. Sounds like it's a labor of love there. Yeah, it sounds like there's passion. And in the sustainability side of things, I'm struggling, with, it seemed like there was a time when in academia we were trying to be proactive about how do we deal with this, thing that we're doing to our planet, and here we are, and we're trying to do that on a micro scale and hope that each of us stitches together and it does better. And now it seems like it's almost like a reactive thing. I don't know, I'm probably repeating a story I can't tell anymore, but NPR had this thing about, like, in the 80s, there was like 8 days where it was over 100 degrees. And now we're projecting the 2030s to be like more than 30 days. And that's from the heat island effect, and that's from global warming. Is there any focus in the sustainable side of, like, how do we, I don't know, after something's done, be able to reduce this problem that's happening, or maybe even proactive? Are you guys targeting that? I'm sure you are.
It's a great question. I would first start by mentioning that even just the term sustainability is really relative in terms of how it's used, and that is, so starts with that. Is sort of first saying, okay, what are we talking about, and realistically, what sort of impact can we have as architects? And one way of talking about sustainability is there are 3 different types. There's when we think globally, 3 different types. There's financial sustainability, and then social sustainability, thinking about things like equity, and then environmental sustainability. And largely in architecture, in our experience as architects, we've found that we can have a little bit bigger impact in the financial component and the environmental component, but it also depends a lot upon the goals of the client, of what the agenda really is. And so when we think about the environmental sustainability component, there are a lot of different things that we do as architects that can impact environmental sustainability, even if it's on a small scale, as you point out. And that has everything to do from site development, the way the site is developed, the way that water is managed, the way that energy is managed, materials and methods, and then indoor environments, which has become a much bigger thing more recently. Typically, we've only thought about it in terms of the environmental component, but now we're thinking about it more in terms of indoor environments, which begins to talk about wellness and health of the occupants. And so that begins to talk more about this kind of social sustainability in terms of just thinking about what would save the planet, but it's also what's good for people. The financial component is also a very complex one, because it has to do with ultimately ROI. And mostly when we talk about the cost of a building, we're talking about the cost on day one. When we talk about cost per foot, we're talking about the cost on day one.
Yep.
But many times there are decisions that are made that have to do with, are you going to pay now or pay later? Like, in terms of, there's always going to be some maintenance in a building, but it's never going to be that whatever you paid on day one, now it's just going to be, it's just going to ride as is. There's always going to be some maintenance, and it costs more typically to have to design and build a lower maintenance building, one that won't need to be constantly maintained and painted, or things need to be replaced all the time. So that's one of the complex things, and sometimes clients don't. Even if they understand the value of trying to do something that's really built to last, that might be too expensive relative to either their budget, what they can get from the bank, or just being how one is financing a project. And so there are a lot of complex moving parts in general, and I understand how sometimes you can reach this point of despair of sort of just throw our hands up in the air and just say, well, I guess this is a runaway train as it is, the way things are going with energy crisis and climate change and those types of things. But I think it's a matter of like finding those windows when you have a chance to make a difference. Like when and again, some projects and some clients, that's just they have different interests, and there's only so much we can do about that. But there are often ways to try to use best practices along the way. But a lot of this comes back to, again, one of the definitions of sustainability that we talk about a lot is just the idea of something to sustain, to endure, to last a long time. And there's a lot of merit in that, in trying to design and build things well. That in and of itself has to do with a measure of sustainability and a stewardship of the financing that's going into it. There are, on the flip side, there are some things that are meant to be temporary. Most of the work that we do isn't, or isn't meant to be a very temporary thing. But there is an argument sometimes for things that are designed to be temporary, where you almost effectively think about it in terms of disassembly required along the way. It's like how can this pavilion or pavilions? For a good example of this is the Serpentine Pavilion in London. Every year they build a pavilion by a famous architect, and of course, an important part of the design of that and then the construction of that is also thinking about the disassembly. How's that going to come apart easily and transform to something else? So again, a lot of in my mind, a lot of sustainability has to do with thinking about what are the goals of the project, what's the timeline, what sort of investment is this, how are you thinking about it in a way that acknowledges those timelines and those larger goals of the project. But it is a very complex thing.
Yeah.
So we sort of have talked about like what sustainability is. Can you go into maybe a little bit into how you apply that in your practice?
Yeah, in terms of applying sustainability in practice, I was fortunate to work for Max Levy, an architect in Dallas, for my first job while finishing undergrad and after undergrad. And Max is an expert in very low-tech sustainability, which I'll elaborate on in a moment. And then I later was fortunate to work for Foster & Partners in London, a very large, high-powered firm, a Pritzker Prize-winning firm that's well known for very high-tech, sustainable strategies. And the former, with Max Levy, a lot of the low-tech sustainability has to do with more passive strategies, thinking about the siting of a building, the orientation of a building. How do you respond to the patterns of the sun, to breezes, to the topography, to trees that exist in the site? How do you design something that just works with nature in a passive way, and really focusing on that, and light and shadows and very simple things, as opposed to high tech, which gets into things like photovoltaics and rainwater collection systems, very advanced building skins in terms of very high tech facades and different elements, and so what we try to do at MFA is to try to balance those two things, and just as a default, as a prerequisite, always sort of have the passive components in mind, and try to design something that's as responsible as it can be on its given site relative to those conditions and the goals of the client or owner. and then begin to talk about implementing high-tech components when it makes sense, and in terms of, and so whether it is the building envelope itself and how much that is meant to be very calibrated and very performative, or if it is active systems like photovoltaics or rainwater collection or whatever the case is. So we, just by default, always try to start with thinking about, as you mentioned earlier, daylight, the sun, try to respond in a very fundamental way to those elements, and then depending upon the budgets or other goals, figure out how many active and high-tech components can or should be folded into the project. Again, it comes back to meeting the expectations of a given client. Like, what are the goals for this? What is the ROI? It's always a value proposition, but trying to balance those things and is what we find being the most important part of what we do, to dial that in to make the most sense for a given project.
I think there would be a time when it would be like electronics, where there's a financial sustainability that you mentioned, that these, and often it's at scale that you can do these high-tech solutions and the project can just eat the cost of whatever this thing is to be sustainable. Do you think that it'll drop like electronics, where these things will be more attainable at a smaller scale, and that we can have, I don't know, better relay systems, or where there'll be stock product that we can get and we can implement them along with the active sustainable measures?
Yeah, I think so. I think with most technology, you're right. Most technology, which whether it's the computer itself, it starts off extremely exclusive and very clunky, and then becomes something that's very manageable and everyone can access, and it's 1,000 times better than it was, and it's alpha and beta version. I think that that is a natural evolution to expect for a lot of the high tech components, all of that technology. But I also don't think that alone gets us there. Even just that alone, I think that the more passive components have to be considered as well. And so, one in terms of thinking about our practice of how we work, we'll often reference, and we learned a lot from regional architecture, because regional architecture in every region, really, including ours, in the Hill Country region, of course, had to be sustainable before there was technology, before we had climate control. But you had to think of ways to deal passively with airflow and managing the sun, managing the heat. We had to do, and the same thing in terms of material. Of course, materials were locally sourced. There was no way to order something internationally.
Learn something from Chaco Canyon. Why did they build the kivas in the ground? Because they were getting underneath to be able to get away from the heat. Or what was the orientation of the kivas to be able to block that south sun? Right.
So there are lessons to learn from that without mimicking exactly. It's like, how can you learn from that and then do something that could be, it can evolve from that, and then incorporate that technology where it makes sense. But I think it's tempting to get caught up in the gadgetry of the technology for all of us. And all of us have different gadgets on us all the time. And we're all guilty of that probably. But I think that the same thing can happen in architecture, where it's going to be about these features and these different components. But in those, there's nothing wrong with having those, but those shouldn't be what define the work. That should be in some way sort of an accessory to the bones of the design. I think so. I think it's a good question, and I do think it's trending toward those types of technologies, including PV panels, becoming more accessible, higher performing, and everything else. But I also think that that's a good example actually with PV panels. If a roof isn't designed in a way that allows for the orientation to be able to capture the sun, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't really matter how much technology you can bring into it if it's not designed in a way where it can be integrated into the initial design.
Yeah, there's got to be some percentage of the value of the sustainability on siding alone, and the capturing of the heat or not, depending on where you're at. Yeah.
Right.
Well, what problems are you currently facing? I mean, what do you see? Maybe some potential issues in the design realm, I guess, so to speak. I mean, just kind of looking into the future. I mean, what do you see as potential issues?
Yeah, I think Austin's a very rapidly growing city, which is overall it's a great thing, but there are growing pains that come with that. I'd say in a lot of ways where the city's in a bit of an identity crisis of figuring out what once used to be sort of a college town, a seat of government, but not a very active town, at least in terms of industry. Now it is evolving a lot, both in terms of population and industry moving into the city, and so from in all sorts of dimensions, we're dealing with the growing pains, whether it's the infrastructure and our highway system and traffic or parking and evolving in all these types of ways. But it's certainly affecting architecture and the building stock. And one of the tensions and problems that we have is inherently if the city keeps growing the way it does, and as I understand, it's doubled in population every 20 years since 1890, and 165 people have moved to Austin every day since the year 2000, and it hasn't slowed down. If that continues to be the case, where the city keeps growing in terms of population and therefore demand of building stock, that is in direct conflict with our zoning and building codes for most of the city, which push us toward low density, and so it's an interesting problem where we have the local interests of neighborhoods, which I fully understand. We have neighborhood associations and homeowners associations that want to maintain a certain traditional neighborhood feel, and that's at odds with the number of people that are moving to town and need a place to stay. And so it really is a challenge, and it's one that's really upstream from where we as architects operate, meaning that it's decided at the urban design, urban planning, political policy side as well as to side. And in a lot of ways, by the time it gets downstream to us, we're given a lot that has a lot of parameters on it, often many of them form-based, such as the McMansion Ordinance, Subchapter F, where we're in some ways sort of coloring between the lines a little bit, and where you can only build out X amount, have X amount of impervious cover, and X amount of density on a given lot. And so that's just a bigger problem that we have, which is exacerbated by the financial components of that. Because of the demand, and the markets here have really been crazy, and the costs of real estate have really been crazy, which again is overall a good thing for the city as opposed to the opposite, but it does have its own problems that are difficult for any one architect to contend with. And so what comes with that often is trying to manage expectations in terms of how far a budget can go, what you can actually do on a given lot. I'll just say that feasibility comes into play a whole bunch. Like just what's actually feasible to do on a given property, and what sort of investment is that. Construction costs are increasing rapidly, and so that's one of those things of trying to manage expectations, which is very hard to do. And none of us have a crystal ball to even know what will happen with everything from construction costs to the policy. Like there's talk of some codes could change to allow for more flexibility to build and develop, but we just don't know. And so it's a challenge that is in many ways quite unique to Austin because of the boom that we currently have. And so it's fun to operate in this. It's fun to work in the city, fun to be a part of it, but it's also hard to wrap your head around how much is changing and how fast. And especially for someone like myself who's originally from Austin, and native Austinites like to be nostalgic and talk about old Austin and all these different things. At the same time, it's hypocritical for me to do so because I'm part of Austin changing. I'm part of the newer Austin that we know. I'm participating in that every day.
But it's an inevitability. If it's a cool place to live, you're going to have people that want to move here. We're going to decide on how we're all going to work together. And so I think controlling the narrative by saying, hey, all right, it's going to happen, and then go for, I don't know, what Code Next was so promising to give us to have a way to move forward, a pathway.
That's exactly it. And so Code Next was trying to allow for some variety in the zoning, but still managing it a bit. But it is this question of a lot of people are moving to Austin for the culture, and we don't want to remove the culture in order to make space for them. Like we want to remove, like, there are a lot of older establishments that have been replaced in order to allow for condos and different things to allow people to move in. So that helps to solve the density problem, but then it has other challenges in terms of cultural value. So it's a really challenging dilemma, but again, a better problem to have than
Right.
a city where everyone's moving out and it's falling apart. And so it's still a challenge, and one that I expect us to be dealing with for a long time. I don't see it in the very near future. These problems going away.
Yeah.
I think there's something we'll just contend with.
Can we go into what Code Next is, maybe for people like myself, who maybe don't understand exactly what you're talking about when you say Code Next? And that's maybe a question for both of you. So
the City of Austin has a land development code. I'm uncertain when it was made. It was it's an older code, and so we tried to become Matt, help me out here. It's be more progressive and rewrite it to be able to allow for density, be a forward-thinking thing instead of looking at the land development code as the Bible, that we could have exceptions for transit corridors and having areas where we have less restriction to be able to accommodate growth. And
can you explain what you mean by density?
Density.
I'm probably going to ask a lot of dumb questions, so
fair.
just
sure.
beware.
So at some point we
Because it seems pretty dense when you go into Austin. It already seems pretty dense. So I don't know. Maybe explain kind of what you mean by that.
Yeah, I don't know. So I don't know how to get in. I don't want to get into Florida area ratios and all that, but like adding more people instead of like a Houston growth.
So you're talking about building up
just,
versus building out,
right? So Houston is a good case study for this,
Okay.
right? It's you kept on realtors say you drive to your pay grade, right? So it's just this idea of that there's this radiating growth that's just this swath of things, and you have this thing where I get on the highway and the highway just grows with the traffic, which creates another set of things called induced demand, where by the time the road's done, then it's already got the capacity of the traffic on it,
right?
And so it's
Time
just
to
this swath of like it's just a pancake. Everything grows, but what we need to do is we need to get more people away. We need to stop taking up more land for housing. We need to have more people in our city centers to be able to densify them and grow sustainably. And so I don't.
Yeah, so it is both talking about density in terms of the population, but then also just the sheer mass of buildings. And so the traditional model in much of the U.S. is the single family house with a yard on primarily the front and back, but really all four sides. Again, just having a detached home. And so even just the idea of having accessory dwelling unit is it's a fairly progressive thing. To have a second structure that could be that can have a separate address is an example of trying to introduce a little more density in the posit, both in terms of the built mass, but also the chance for more people to be able to occupy the lot. And so what Code Next was trying to get into is finding many other ways to try to find that. So rather than only single family homes and huge apartment complexes, trying to allow for a lot of things in the middle of duplexes, quadplexes, low-rise development, trying to create
The missing middle.
Trying to create a lot of different options and giving more flexibility in the zoning so that it wouldn't be just the extreme of the towers and the little houses, but that you could have these sort of undulating transitions that I forget the exact term, compatibility, talking about sort of these sort of sloping of different, just different varieties of density of structures that then would allow for a lot more people to live in closer proximity to then make walkable neighborhoods where one could then walk to lots of different amenities, potentially walk to work, and not make the city as car based. And so Code Next, I mean, it was, I believe the draft was 1,600 pages. It's extremely in depth, but a lot of it had to do with just trying to provide more opportunities for, let's just say, architectural diversity, which could then allow for lots of other types of diversity and for the city to evolve in lots of different ways. And it ran into a lot of resistance along the way, and part of that's just as progressive of a city as Austin is, that sort of change begins to challenge what some of us are used to in terms of neighborhoods and some of the different entrenched things that go with that. And so it was something that I think its heart was in the right place and was trying to really evolve this. But to do something that could be comprehensively passed and accepted by the whole city is extremely difficult.
Yeah.
As Mark's saying, it was having to change something that's been in place for a very long time to then have a sweeping change to the entire thing overnight. It's a bit of a big pill to swallow.
Yeah.
For the city.
Yeah, no, I agree with Matt. We have to have this transitional thing. We have to be more critical and ask more out of our cities. We have to learn to love what it means to be in a cool place and have density and ask more out of our city. And so I don't know. Hopefully with time, I don't know what's on the next agenda with the council to be able to, if we got another code next, but I think that'll help us as the architects and designers to be able to make it not a sprawling city. And I think that in some ways it'll help preserve what Austin wants. It's not that it steals away from it, that it's a way moving forward rather than having no plan at all.
I think that often it's tempting to put things into, to polarize things and to think about it as choosing one or the other. And one of those being city or nature. And people sort of imagining that you're choosing just a concrete jungle or complete nature. And obviously it doesn't have to be either extreme. And you can have green components in a very big density. Even, of course, Manhattan has quite a lot of greenery and quite a lot of density and a large population. And even the most extreme dense example that we have still has a fair amount of greenery. And so I think that it's tempting to fall into that trap to think, this increasing density means that we're going to lose, for example, some of the green character that Austin has. And of course, it's correct to think about preservation. For example, with Barton Springs, there was the whole Save Our Springs initiative when there was development proposed that was going to threaten the watershed of the aquifer and of Barton Springs. And that's an example where even those that would completely support increasing density, that's just not the place to do it. And so there's a way of, and again, not to model it after New York at all, but there are ways to reserve certain zones and pockets while still increasing density in other ways. And there are times when there are views of Austin. There's one from right where Redbud Trail intersects with Westlake, and you look back to the city, and it looks like you're just looking at a park. It's completely, it's just looks like all trees right before you see the Capitol and downtown. And it's hard to believe that's actually a full city. Those are full neighborhoods there. So it's wonderful that we have that many trees. At the same time, at what cost of the sprawl? Is there a balance? Is there a way that we can find to develop, in those areas and in those zones, to have both city and nature and all those things to interlock a bit more. The question of infrastructure is a whole other one to do with our road system and dependence on cars, which is largely a cultural thing. And so there are other things that can go with this. That there are other things besides buildings that have a direct impact on the experience in the city and the way that we develop or grow a city or don't. And so it's a really complex issue, that this notion of thinking about how to grow, what's the right way to grow. But I really do believe that there's a way to try to find a middle ground between most of these things. It's not as simple as the binary of, as I said, of city and nature. There's a way to try to achieve both. But I think that the idea of either extreme, especially the idea of people sort of imagine a concrete jungle when they think of development and density sometimes, but it doesn't have to be. There can be plenty of ways to have your cake and eat it too, so to speak.
Let's make from 15th to Cesar Chavez, 35 to Mopac, no cars. No cars. You park on the outside, little trolley system in the middle of the road.
Are they trying to do that? It seems like that's what they're...
I want that to happen.
Okay. I don't spend enough time down there, so it doesn't bug me at all. Yeah, it seems like it's this delicate balance. I mean, you talk about these neighborhoods that have a lot of... it looks like you're looking at a park, but it's actually this neighborhood. And it seems like to get that comes at a cost. Mm-hmm. So I guess it kind of begs the question where we have these low-income neighborhoods of these new developments of low-income housing. I guess we're not seeing that a whole lot of, where you have this like separation, between the houses and you get a lot of greenery in there. It seems like, and that, I think that's just kind of the nature of the beast where, you got to have affordable housing. Not everybody can live in the big mansions and afford the property. So it seems like it's this really delicate, this balance between cost and, getting these dense areas, but also kind of, what am I trying to say? Kind of work with the land, so to speak. So
you're talking about affordability. I'm buying a house right now, and I qualified for...
talk about that.
Yeah. And I qualified for the Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac because of my salary, and I learned that the average income in Austin now, the median income, I guess isn't the same, is $120,000. So over the past...
For a household?
For a household. So over the past, decade with all these new jobs, it's increased that number. And I know that, there's people that they're fourth and fifth generation Austinites that, had their family pass down the house and, taxes on that. Just it's chasing away.
Taxes. Oh my gosh. I just had to go through all that crap.
I don't know. I was just shocked to know that the average household income is $120,000. That's an island in this state, and far cry from what it once was. And I don't know. Yeah, it's not helping preserve these, the artists and the people who have lived here for a really long time.
Yeah. Speaking of art, I want to go back now to young Matt Fajkus. You said that you were into art early on, into drawing, sketches. If you can kind of talk about, in your formative years, what do you think influenced you to get into architecture?
Yeah, going way back, when I was very young, a toddler to kind of early, let's say grade school years, I had a speech impediment where I just had a bad stutter, and I think that's what. So I had a hard time expressing myself verbally. And so I think that's what began me being able to express myself visually. I could draw things, and that sort of became my outlet. Oh. I think I've never that's never been really diagnosed, but as I reflect on, I've reflected on that over the years, and I remember drawing and sketching and really trying to capture the world around me. So it was often sometimes documenting the world around me, other times just sketching, just imaginative things. And it was that combined with the fact that for some reason when I was a child I didn't take naps. So typically all small children take naps, and I remember in probably preschool or kindergarten there was a time when they would say it's nap time, kids, and everyone would roll out this sort of mat and sleep on the mat. And I remember I got my mom to write a note for me to bring in and just say he doesn't take naps. Is it possible he can do something else? He just doesn't take naps. And so they put me. I guess I was in kindergarten. They put me with fifth graders or something for that nap hour. They put me in the back of the room and just let me just draw on my sketchbook. And I remember thinking, those suckers gave in the nap time, and I got out of it. I don't have to do the nap. And then, of course, by the time I was in college, I would have done anything to show up for an 8 o'clock class and for the professor to say, hey, why don't you guys all go home and take a nap? I would have done anything for that.
Boswell would never allow that.
never would have happened. But I think that those those things interestingly began to allow me to kind of develop an interest and skills and in kind of drawing and creating things. And then in high school, I had a couple of art teachers, and made a big impression on me in terms of teaching me a lot of different skills. And one of them, Dr. Oliver was his name. He would often say, he would say something about Mr. Aspiring Architect, or he would always make some sort of reference to architecture quite a lot. And during my freshman year of high school, I remember that, and that planted a seed for me, I think, because it wasn't until I was graduating from high school that I really decided what I might try for as a major, and it was really just because I was pressured into it. I was like, you had to commit to something. And it just sort of seemed like, well, I guess I'll try architecture. I enjoy drawing, and it seems that drawing's a part of architecture. And I also really like to draw in buildings, like sketching buildings, drawing buildings in a very detailed way. And so that was a really big influence. And I actually am in debt in a lot of ways to Dr. Oliver, because he was also he challenged me a lot in a way that I thought was that frustrated me at the time, because I felt as though he held me to a higher standard than all the other students.
Held you to your potential, probably.
I guess so, because initially, like I remember doing some of the early artwork in that class, and then at some point he pulled me aside and he said, "What's going on? Why are you not performing as well as you can?" And I said, "What do you mean? I'm doing the same thing everyone else is doing." And he said, "Exactly." Mm-hmm. Exactly. He said, "You shouldn't be doing the same thing everyone else is doing." So he put me in the corner of a cubicle, hidden in the corner of a room where I couldn't talk to any other students for the rest of the year. And I hated it, because I just, like all the other freshmen, I wanted to socialize, and I wanted to, especially in that case, I was a new student, had just moved to that town in high school, wanted to try to acclimate, and instead I was sort of put on an island. And he gave me assignments that were much more difficult than all the other students, and I resented that at the time, because I just wanted to be just one of the normal students. I wanted to be accepted with everyone else. I wanted to be. I didn't want to be challenged in that way, but that gave me a lot of fundamentals in terms of working with different media. Whether it was pen and ink, or whether it was with Prismacolors or watercolor. I just learned to use lots of different things in lots of different ways, and ways to draw space. Well, he gave me a lot of freedom to draw whatever I wanted quite often, but it often would be buildings and spatial things. And so that was certainly formative and set in motion a lot of things. I later realized, when getting into architecture school, that drawing is an important part of the process, but it's really a tool along the way. It's so much more about creative thinking and thinking about systems, thinking coordinating and collaborating a lot of different things, and not the drawing is a tool you use to represent your ideas, but you have to have an idea as well. So it's actually, I had to then, once I got into architecture school, realized I had to grow in a whole bunch of other ways that I hadn't expected to. But that interest in art from a really young age, I think, was a pretty common thread that enabled me to be able to. Yeah, it was a sort of a launching pad to a lot of other things.
I often feel like lucky. Like, we ask 18-year-olds, "Hey, go find out what you want to do for the rest of your life," and it's darts at a dartboard, and it's kind of unfair. And I feel so lucky that I chose architecture, because, like, still I'm giddy about it. I'm excited about it. And yeah, it's interesting hearing you talk about what you would draw, and it's something that I don't know, you're familiar with, right? We all walk into spaces, we all know buildings, and I don't know, to have that fascination hit and still be curious is I don't know. I feel fortunate for finding it.
So I've been, you remind me a lot about this. I've been reading this book called Outliers by Malcolm Gladwell. I don't know if you've heard of it or not.
I have.
But so he in the book he goes into, and I think you fit this almost perfectly, like you and your your journey and then and your architecture firm now, y'all are really outliers in the architecture world. And he goes into he looks at a lot of like big tech guys and maybe these oil tycoons and a lot of like highly successful billionaires and people who have basically found success and, you know, gone and kind of looked at, you know, what it is and their about them personally and maybe what about their environment that led them down the path that they're on. And so it's interesting to hear your story because it very much fits what he's talking about, like what I'm reading right now. He was talking, I'm probably going to butcher it, but he was kind of talking about Bill Gates' background and Steve Jobs and kind of coming up in the in the 70s, you know, when the first supercomputers were first coming out, and he goes into that idea about 10,000 hours, how it takes 10,000 hours to master any one skill, and a lot of these guys, the reason why they're so successful is because they had so much time early on in their lives when they were very young on these computers that were just coming out and they were brand new, and they just so happened to be going to this private school that, you know, this computer club bought the first computer and they got to tinker with it and play with it. And then they moved on to high school and college. And, you know, when the computers started to really take off and so they were able to kind of hone and master their skills to the point where they were in college. And then they, you know, after graduating college, rather, they would go off into these industries, and now they were above everybody else because they were introduced to the computer very early on. And so when you talk about your early stages, about how you were drawing at a very young age and how you feel like that was the only way you could communicate, that kind of seems like that began your journey of mastering a certain skill, right, of expressing yourself through drawing and through art. So I'm happy to hear you talk about that because that really fits in. I think you fit that definition of an outlier, you know, in architecture, really.
I appreciate that. I think that as part of an overall trajectory of developing any skill or ability in any discipline, but certainly what I've found in architecture is that very direct skill and direct relationship to the craft is important. I think that idea of developing the craft or a certain skill is important to set up the trajectory, but at some point you have to find a way to teach others. Or otherwise you're really limiting the ultimate impact you can have. And I realized that pretty early on when first starting to practice. I'd taken on 3 projects. So I was teaching full time and trying to design 3 different houses and do all the drawings, all the production for all of them, and realized pretty quickly I was hitting my capacity. And I had been, up until that point, I had a lot of pride in my drawings and what I wanted to do. And I up until that point, I had a problem delegating and realized I've got to learn ways to share this with others and to trust other people and to begin to establish a framework in a team that can really run with this, or else I'm really limiting my capacity. I can't scale. You can't even take on even one very large complex project, much less than doing multiple projects, right? And so there was the first kind of trying to learn all these skills myself, and then I quickly realized that I needed to be able to share it with others, but then also realizing that other people had other different skills that they were better at certain things than I was, and it's like that complements really well the way that I think and what my strengths are. And so that was actually a really rewarding part of the process, was learning, okay, no matter how far I try to go in terms of mastering something, at some point you feel like that begins to level out. You go, well, I don't know how much further I can push this. But what I really began to appreciate was the idea of collaborating with others and realizing, it's actually really great. And both in terms of collaborating with others within our own design team, but then with other experts that are out there, whether it is the builders, general contractors, consultants, and even our clients, owners have a lot of knowledge in different things, a lot of accomplishments. Then just realizing, okay, let's allow all the skill set that I've learned to become something that our team begins to engender, begins to embody, and then something that we can fold in all these other things to, and then it just kind of just catapults to a whole new dimension that you couldn't, I couldn't have ever foreseen, and something better than I could have come up with on my own, which is really a really fun aspect of that trajectory.
So like letting those who you teach turn around and then teach you in a way. Yeah.
Exactly.
I'm glad you mentioned that because I was reading an article. I think it was Modern Architecture. I'm not sure. I don't remember the publication, but they were talking to you about your firm, and you said something here of note that it really stuck with me because I think the question was you hire a lot of UT grads, a lot of students, and basically, like I said, you're letting the student turn around and then kind of contribute and teach as much as they know how. And let's see, you said what could a student teach? But if students bring their ideas, the ideas of someone not yet proven, their humility and their critical thinking skills, they also bring a different perspective. So kind of tying into what you said, it just they can put their idea out there, whether it's good or bad. It's an opportunity to learn. For everybody, you might take parts of that idea and be like, this is really good, but the rest of it's kind of garbage, and here's why. And so I think it's just bringing a different perspective to the team kind of helps build everybody up and make everybody better.
Yeah, that's a real fun part of our brainstorming sessions, which in architecture we call design charrettes, where at different stages of the project, we all come to the table and kind of sort of casually throw around different ideas of what direction the design could go, and everyone has to enter into that without much ego, of just be willing to be part of the conversation. Yeah. But you can't enter in with this ego of like, I'm going to have the best idea. My idea needs to win, but rather, hopefully we come up with the best idea together, and let's all support that, and it's going to make us all better. Let's figure out what's the best idea we can come up with, and all rally behind that. And it's usually not even as simple as one person's idea. You start riffing off of each other, and it takes on a life of its own. And that does require principal architects, for Sarah Johnson and myself, that requires us to go in knowing that, being open-minded to where it can go. Even if we have some ideas of our own, we're not going to try to cram those down the throat of the project. Instead, say, okay, we have some ideas we're going to put on the table, but someone might challenge these and bring up the issues that we hadn't thought of, problems with those, or different things. And that's really fun. That process is fun because I think everyone feels like you're participating, and we know that the idea is certainly not always going to be mine, or actually it's usually not my idea. That when it's not, at least it's not just a pure version of my idea that ends up winning. I'm part of the conversation just like everyone else is, and that's a little bit different than the traditional model of architecture that Frank Lloyd Wright would have had, for example, where it was typically Frank Lloyd Wright and a bunch of interns that
top down,
and he clearly had an incredible, an endless bandwidth of design ideas in a way that most people don't in the first place. But it was just a very different model. It was very top down, very authoritarian, which worked for him certainly. And that was more of a traditional model in the past. And I think that pretty early on, as I mentioned, I realized that I was better when working in a collaborative, working in a team, and helping to lead that team, run that team, but to allow others to participate. And it tends to, like I said, not only empower them and allow them to grow in different ways and encourage them, but it just makes the work better and makes our work more. I think our work more interesting. I think that there's a reason why no two of our projects look identical, which we're proud of. We don't want to be known of as creating the same thing and just stamping it out all around the city or all around the country, but instead designing something that's really custom and unique to what makes sense for that given site and that client.
Yeah, it's not a typology either, right? There's I don't know what you've done, like the bat houses. You've done that. You took you made a runway show with paper hangers. You go out to a boat dock and make the damnedest, most beautiful boat dock on Lake Austin. Like you're curious. I see the curiosity in your work, and then
Very experimental.
ambition to to hammer out the idea. It's rigorous, but it's beautiful. Yeah.
No, I appreciate that. That's something that has been very intentional from the beginning, to not get pinned down to be a one-trick pony, to be seen as the firm that does one very specific type of project, or does remodels in this parts of town, or creates restaurants in this part of town, or whatever. It's like, yes, and it could be any of those things. Those we've always tried to avoid being put into a box of, oh, you are this one, this is what you're capable of, we'll can put you over there, but instead say, we're really about being designers, and ultimately we think of design as creative problem solving. It's like, if there's a problem to be solved, and can we solve it creatively, and so it can be solved in a way that works functionally and is aesthetically rich as well. And that can come in the form of a boat dock, or a fashion show backdrop, or a freestanding house, or a medical facility. The Westlake Dermatology Marble Falls building is a doctor's office.
Beautiful.
To win an AAA national award, but trying to remove the stigma of going to the doctor. Instead of, in many ways, instead of trying to think about, well, what's a typical doctor office like, and what can we do instead, saying, what can it be instead, and can we think about it? Can we think about the function of what it needs to do, but how can we make it something that really transcends or elevates above your typical expectation of a doctor office? So all of those typologies have a lot of potential, and we like to be a little bit chameleons in that sense. And so that, because ultimately what our clients are paying for is a process, not a product. They're not buying that car off the lot that's a ready-made thing. They're paying for a process for us to creatively problem solve, in this instance, for them and with them, and that's a lot of fun. It's a more lucrative business model to sell products. They get off the shelf with the assembly line going, and just like stamp out a bunch of mass production and sell all those things. That's simply more lucrative. Yeah. But that's not what ultimately we're really doing. They're hiring us for that process along the way, which has an unexpected and unknown outcome, which is extremely exciting and terrifying every time.
Yeah, for sure. Well,
appreciate you coming out this way, and coming on the podcast.
Yeah, we really appreciate your time. We know you're an extremely busy guy, so we appreciate you taking some time out of your day to come sit down with us. Hopefully we can get you back on some point in the future. But Matt, it's been a pleasure talking to you.
Yeah, great to meet you, Lonnie. Great to meet you, Mark.
Yeah. Awesome. Thanks, you.
Appreciate it.
We hope you enjoyed this discussion. For more information on upcoming episodes, follow us on Instagram. Feel free to leave us your thoughts to help us shape future podcasts.